So, hello everyone, and welcome to what's going to be one of the few verdicts I've done in quite a long time. Today, we are going to be talking about Assassin's Creed Valhalla. One of the things I really like about this game, right off the bat, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is at this point just another long entry in the Assassin's Creed franchise. I'm pretty sure we're on probably game number 12 or 13 of the main line of games, and it's been running for quite a long while, as far back as 2007. I'm pretty sure it almost doesn't really need an introduction, but since the series series reboot of 2015, where after Syndicate they decided to take a year off to completely reanalyze what they could do, we've had Assassin's Creed Origins, which introduced a more open world style of gameplay, more level based progression, more active combat system, which continued and, in my opinion, was perfected almost in Odyssey, where we completely upped the ante on almost every system in Origins and almost everything else. And that kind of brings us to today. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and just to set the tone for the most part for the rest of this verdict, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, in almost every single way, is either the inverse of Odyssey or just a more watered down version of it. And I'm not really sure why that is the case. I'm not really sure what made them decide to take what were, in my opinion, very fun, very interesting mechanics from Odyssey on almost every single level, and then not only to not use them again, but almost to introduce things that like fundamentally are worse in a lot of ways. And we're going to get into that because basically the biggest part of this review, and I guess any review for that matter, is the gameplay. So, similar to its predecessors, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is an open world game. It takes place in 9th century England, where you play as Eivor, who is leading his clan and alongside his brother trying to found a village and find a home where they can just be at peace and live together. And that takes them out of Norway and into England, where it brings them into conflict with with local Saxons who don't want to share their lands with the invaders, as well as just other people who are already there from Norway or other places who ally with them. And that basically sets up the tone for this game. The game is an area by area progression, at least the story is. Similar to other Assassin's Creed games, there's a whole bunch of areas that are all joined together, at least the last couple of games, where you have areas that are all basically landlocked in this game, and you travel between them. They're different zones, right? And if you've played a game, if you could say as far back as Assassin's Creed Origins, if you played something like World of Warcraft, the areas are kind of laid out similarly. You go in one area, there's a bunch of things you could do in that area. There's quests you could do in that area. And then once you're done, you move on. And there's nothing wrong with this style of gameplay. In fact, I actually kind of prefer it when it's done well. It's not done poorly here. I wouldn't even say it's done average. I think the area by area progression of this game is really nice because you get a sense of finality once you've succeeded and done everything in an area, which is always very helpful. It's sort of like a nice, good closure. Um, but, but, I will say, and one of the worst elements of this game that I am going to get into are the world events. So Valhalla, unlike almost any other open world game that I can think of off the top of my head, neglects to use the idea of a side quest, a quest that's not as important as the main quest. Basically, all quests are given importance. There is a main story. You're not required to do every little thing. There are side quests in the game, but the open world contains these things which are called world events. And world events, in my opinion, are not only a massive waste of time, they add nothing, and they really don't even direct you on how to solve them half the time. It's basically like an open world puzzle where you can't even review the clues you've been given. You can't really do anything. Just an NPC will talk to you once or twice, and then that's it. And then you have to sort of figure out, either from doing it, what they want, or whatever. And normally this isn't a problem, but sometimes you might not have the right equipment for the thing. Sometimes you might just be passing by. You might want to do it later. And if you do so, the game kind of will not give you any, kicks in the ass to figure out where you left off or where to do it. And in my mind, like, that's what a journal is for in a game, right? That's what a quest log is for. You know, it's not necessarily meant to be a walkthrough, but it's meant to be sort of a reminder, like, hey, this is what you need to do. This is what was going on. This is, in general, what, you know, to remind you what's really going on and how to complete this quest. And that's what a journal has been used for as long as I can remember in a ton of video games. You know, when they have quests and stuff, there's usually a journal where you can do that. And the thing is that that's already in the game, but only for main quests. And unlike unlike main quests, world events do not get markers on the map. You don't get a little thing in the top left corner of the screen telling you what they want or how to do it. Even within like the general vicinity, right, of that quest, you would think maybe they would do that. And it's just a really poor system, I think, that has been done better by almost any game with an open world, pseudo open world, or even just quest structure in general. And that kind of brings me into my next topic about this game, is the leveling system. So everything you do in this game gives you experience points. I think that's fairly standard in almost any video game you play with any leveling component. Everything you do, from killing enemies to completing quests to finding locations to doing different things, all gives you some amount of experience. And then once you get enough experience, predictably, you level up, which gives you, in this game, 2 or 3 extra bonus points. Now, to finish what I was talking about with world events, which are these vague, you know, wastes of time, I basically stopped doing world events ages ago as far as the game is concerned. And I was still able to do everything else on the map and get to 400. And even then, beyond that, once you actually get to the max level for the base game, there's no DLC out that I'm aware of so far, you get what's called mastery points. And if you played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you'll know that mastery points allow you to just up stats. But in this game, and this is going to really lead into probably the biggest complaint I have about this, is that the side quests in this game, or I'm sorry, the extra points that you get in this game don't really help you that much. In fact, by level 340, I was able to beat basically the hardest challenge in the game, which is a 400 enemy that you need to kill. And I was able to do that pretty much with no problem, just bashing away. And this is kind of the problem I have with Assassin's Creed Valhalla's gameplay, is that it's unnecessarily complex and unfun for basically no reward. And I say that because in Odyssey, you had a variety of stats. You had tons of different ways to level Alexios or Cassandra, and tons of different styles to play. There were tons of different ways you could, you know, break into places, start killing enemies. Even if you were a combat-based character, there's still a lot of different builds you can run and things you could do. You know, there's at least a handful, right? You know, there's more than just like mash Hidden Blade or mash sword until everything in front of you dies. And I kind of like that, you know, the parrying system, the quick dodge system. You could have different things like poison and fire. And all of that is still in Valhalla. It's just way less impactful and way less mandatory. For starters, Valhalla has a stamina system, like Dark Souls. But unlike Dark Souls and any other game that has a stamina system, there's no real way to, like, upgrade it. You can make your gear way less, but that doesn't really, like, change how much stamina you use. In fact, I fully maxed out my gear on upgrades for the most part, and I didn't notice any amount of stamina, you know, being conserved. I wasn't able to land any extra dodges or anything. But ultimately, stamina, I feel, is kind of pointless, because I played the game with 2 shields, and I was just able to bash the shit out of enemies nonstop, no problem, and nothing bad really happened. I just mashed light attack. Light attack in this game, when it succeeds in hitting an enemy, will give you back stamina, which you are then supposed to use on heavy attacks, which do more damage, do more stagger, and take up stamina and don't refund it. But because you could just spam light attack and kill an enemy even faster, because heavy attacks have a wind up and have more stuff you could get hit out of. You know, light attacks are quick, give you back stamina if they hit, so you're even whatever ones you miss, you get stamina back as long as you can hit. And that leaves you with more stamina to be able to dodge and strafe and get around. And in my opinion, the renders heavy attacks pointless, which also kind of renders the stamina system pointless once you really realize that. And that goes back again, I feel, to the stats element of this game. Stats in Assassin's Creed Valhalla really just kind of don't matter. Unlike in Assassin's Creed, for instance, I'll take my Odyssey playthrough. In my Odyssey playthrough, I ended up going on like a poison build. I was kind of like an assassin who was pretty good in combat, but I would prefer stealth, but I could still hold my own. And maybe the game is easy. Again, I don't play these games on anything higher than normal, but maybe, there was definitely a certain point in every open world game, especially, where the challenge of the game and your power level sort of meet, right? Like, if the challenge of the game is almost linear, your power level starts out basically exponential and then really starts to take off later on in the game. And there's that, basically the intersection, the tipping point, where you just start to kind of become more powerful than the stuff in the world, which I don't have a problem with. But unfortunately, the stats in this game don't really ever matter. If you just keep up reasonably upgrading your gear and putting points into literally anything on the chart, because Valhalla uses a constellation grid similar to, I guess, Skyrim and the sphere grid of Final Fantasy X. But while it all loops together, ultimately what really matters is just spending the points in general. It doesn't matter if what you spend your points in, because to reach max level in this game, you have to complete the whole chart anyway. There's 400 nodes. So you're going to get everything anyway. Everyone's Eivor is going to be the same level 400 as everyone else's Eivor. And by the end of the game, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it means that ultimately there's no real difference in stats. There's no reason for them to really exist. Other than for weapons, having weapon variety, the whole idea of upgrading your light damage doesn't really matter when everyone at the end of the game is going to have the same light damage. And what really matters is your stats. Because once you get to a certain point in the game, you're just 2-3-shotting enemies. It never changes. There's no variety to it. There's no gradient of enemy difficulty. You'll never be able to really one-shot them unless you get a critical. And I just think that means that most of these systems are kind of pointless. Whereas in Odyssey, and in fairness, Odyssey also kind of suffers from this because of its level scaling. You once you get to a certain point, enemies just generally die in 2 to 3 hits. But at least you were still able, for the higher level enemies, and there were definitely a lot of them, enemies that are on your level or better, you could still have a good fight with them. You could feel that an enemy that is way higher level than you is still reasonable for you to defeat. And because of that, it doesn't feel like you're really wasting too much time leveling up and picking builds, which then leads me into my next point, is that Valhalla is a much slower paced game than Assassin's Creed Odyssey. In Odyssey, there's a variety of things for you to pick at the start. You could see right at the start of the game what you want to equip and what abilities you want to put on. And from that, you can decide how you want to even just fight basically in combat. So, for instance, for my Alexios, I had 1 or 2 stealth moves, and then everything else was some sort of combat move that would help me get, the best out of combat. And, I'm sure there's tons of abilities that are kind of universal, like the healing ability and other things like that. But in general, my idea at the end of my DLCs was I want to enter combat, find the biggest enemy that I can, and basically lock him into at least a couple of seconds worth of high damage. And that's generally how I would play the game, is I would buff myself, I'd do my almost 30 seconds worth of continuous attacks on him, during which I'm invincible, and then from there just proceed to regain my adrenaline and keep that cycle going. Valhalla uses the same adrenaline system, but I found that the abilities in this game pretty much are garbage until the very end of the game. It's not like Odyssey, where you have something like Hero Strike or the Spartan Kick that are generally like really good early on and you're able to use it. Valhalla starts you out with one adrenaline socket, maybe 2, and you only get 4 by the end of the game, whereas Odyssey was letting you spend multiple on things like overpower attacks and whatnot, which are gone now, by the way. Valhalla seems to favor a more passive style of gameplay, more based around parrying and perfect dodging, which wouldn't be a problem. It just means that the other systems, need to reflect that. You need to be able to see, like, if I go a full parry build, I can one-shot enemies on the riposte. If I go a full striking build and I want to be an agile dodger, you can kind of favor to that. but it just doesn't really amount to anything. It feels empty and hollow, like they're just upgrades for the sake of having upgrades to feel like you're progressing through the story. And I also mentioned healing earlier in this game. In Odyssey, and especially in Origins, you used to heal through either using Second Wind or by hitting an enemy and basically getting health back on hit, which was a very, very helpful thing to have. That exists in Valhalla, but what Valhalla chooses to do, I guess to kind of make the game seem harder, is to have a ration system. So basically, if you get hurt in the game from falling or combat or whatever, or if you get poisoned and need to cleanse yourself, what you can do is you can eat a ration. And what that will do is it'll give you back some percentage of your health. I don't know how it works. And you can only carry 3 of them. Now, early in the game, as I said before, you know, you're on the curve of difficulty for these types of games. Early in the game, it's very difficult. You know, sometimes you have to ask, is it worth engaging? Is it worth whatever? Whereas later in the game, I found that the health on hit option, where I would get hit by an enemy and hit them again to get it back, basically the Bloodborne system where you strike enemies after getting hit to regain your health, I found that that was almost enough 90% of the time to get me through almost any fight, no matter how difficult the enemy was. And so I kind of feel like ultimately the ration system doesn't, it's just there kind of as a collar. It's sort of like a leash almost. And it's not bad, but I feel like to recover rations is kind of wishy-washy. You have to collect food from around the world. Sometimes it's easy, it's very quick, but sometimes, you know, you'll get out of a tough fight. Oh man, I barely survived that, or I had to run away and I had to use rations to do it. You know, where am I going to get the stuff from? And you're kind of left, you know, you might find 1 or 2 bushes, but you need to complete a full ration before you can actually get it, you know, get another one. So, like, the scavenging isn't a bad thing if they wanted this to be a more survival-based game, but it doesn't really help the fast-paced nature you kind of would expect from Assassin's Creed at this point. Whereas in Odyssey, you had a cooldown for Second Wind, and you could reduce the cooldown. There's tons of points you could put into it. You could have armor engravings that do that. And in this game, you have runes, which are basically armor engravings, but they're not as good because they don't really help you as much. Like I said before, the armor engravings in Odyssey, I could clearly tell were having a very, very definitive effect on my build, on how I played the game. The engravings I got in Valhalla weren't really that helpful, and I couldn't even tell. Like I said before, I put in a bunch of runes to up my light attack, and I was still 2 to 3 shotting enemies. You know, I wasn't one-shotting enemies that were below me. I wasn't one-shotting enemies at my level. Everything was basically a 2 to 3 hit, so I didn't really notice or feel that anything was changing as a result of me putting stuff in. So the engravings don't really help. The weapon abilities themselves are noticeable, which brings me to one of my next point, is the loot in this game is finite. And what I mean by that is there's not an endless supply of weapons and armor that you could pick up in this game like you would in Odyssey. In Odyssey, you could fight a group of people. Some of them would drop like a chest plate, right? But this chest plate is a randomly generated chest plate by the game. You know, it's random loot. Whereas in Valhalla, they don't have that system. There's only a finite amount of things you can get. And what that should mean, in theory, is that everything is unique, special. It diversifies something. It really makes it feel good. Whereas what really happens is that everything kind of equalizes at a point. And I think, again, that's one of the faults of the game, is that ultimately it didn't really matter what I wore. Like, there are armor sets, which I guess could maybe change it, but I was never pushed nor challenged to try out anything new. And ultimately, I feel like upgrade materials, as scarce as they are in this game, which is one of my big complaints about the game, don't really allow you to freely customize and change out what you're wearing. So in Odyssey, you could change out what you're wearing almost at any time. A quick trip to the blacksmith will have you upgrade materials. It could be immediately usable for you. You could go to the blacksmith and change the engravings on it as well. You could do a whole bunch of other stuff with it. And, you know, let's say 5 minutes later you find a better piece. Okay, well, as long as you have the supplies and the money, you could upgrade it, because money was way more flowing in Odyssey. Supplies and materials were way easier to come by, way easier to purchase, way easier to use, and there were more ways to get it. You know, you could rob merchant ships, you could do a whole bunch of other stuff. And in this game, you don't have that option. And rather than that, like, yeah, you could get materials and upgrades. Ore is so hard to come by in this game that just breaking open ore could take you 20 hours itself, I feel. Because you're getting ore in increments of like 1 and 2 and 5. And at most, you could only buy 200 from a store. It doesn't seem like stores restock them that often, if at all. So leather is plentiful. You can hunt animals for a little bit. That's fine. But ore is way harder to get. Fabric is something that you don't even get till late in the game, and I feel that that's kind of poor. I feel like fabric is actually one of the things they gate you to prevent you from getting more than 3 rations, by the way. It's something you need to upgrade your quiver and your rations. I found that I just ended up dumping it all into my rations whenever I could towards the end of the game. But by the end of the game, it didn't matter because I didn't really need 6 rations anyway, which is the max that you can get. Uh, Additionally, like I said before, in Odyssey, you could rob merchants, to get materials, right? It was like Black Flag in that regard. On the high seas, you could sail out and about. And in Valhalla, you don't have that option. They kind of have it with what's called monastery raids, where you'll roll up in your ship and you'll raid a monastery with your group. And basically, it's similar to like the open warfare elements from Odyssey, where you would have the Spartans and the Athenians clashing on the battlefield, and you would pick a side and fight for them. And that was one of the things I kind of thought was lukewarm in that game, because it didn't really add much, and by the end of the game, you probably weren't doing it. But in this game, like, you kind of need to do the monastery things because you need those materials to upgrade your city of Ravensthorpe, which eventually must lead to something. There weren't enough monasteries in the game for me to do it, which means I would need to track down unmarked treasure chests one by one. Um, but the monastery raids aren't bad. They've really just kind of boiled down to the same stuff in different environments. You run in, you kill the guards, your people might get downed, you revive them, you break open a door, which requires you to wait for your teammate to come to you, and then you open a chest, which also requires a teammate to come help you. And the AI is helpful, but not that great. They'll sometimes get stuck trying to rush to you if you want to open a chest, or run across the map and try to kill an enemy that's still alive, who's on alert, obviously, but not actively trying to get to you, or just stuck. It's not the best, it's not the worst, it just kind of is meh. And like I said, there's not enough to fully get Ravensthorpe to max level. I think that's probably one of the worst elements of it, is that, yeah, you want to get it to rank 6, but you need to basically farm to level up stuff. I also mentioned that you have to roll up in your longship as Vikings. You raid out of your longship. The ship elements in this game is almost nothing to talk about. It's basically a taxi on water. You can kind of fire arrows from it. There's one mission in the game where you kind of get the feeling like you're firing arrows, but it's none of the same complexity and depth as Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Black Flag or Rogue or any of the other games where it's been done. It's not even close to that. And I think ultimately that's one of the big problems with it, is like, it just ends up being a taxi. It's like Final Fantasy 15's Regalia. Like, initially it sounded like something cool, but then when you actually play it, it really isn't. And that's unfortunate, because I feel like they could have done more with it. And if that wasn't what they wanted to have a focus of the game be, obviously then you would say, well, the other systems in the game kind of benefit from it, which is not the case at all. Or at least presumably not the case at all. Valhalla's biggest foible, in my opinion, is that they also have another form of raid where you basically attack a castle. And this one's done a little bit less than the monastery raids. It's basically like a multi-step invasion where you and your story companions need to break into a castle so you can finish the story. It only ever seems to be done as part of the story, and because of that, it's basically linked to it. It's not a bad thing. In fact, it's nice to kind of break it up. You feel like you're building towards this big heist, this big assault. But I feel like the build up more for these is generally the same thing. Once you've been to 2, 3, 5, 10 areas in this game, you more or less know how the flow of the game is. So by the time I was doing, the next to last castle raid, I pretty much knew what was going on. There was nothing really too unique or anything about it. The frame rate chugs during these things, by the way. It dips on base PS4. So that is something to be mindful of. I also mentioned before that you could upgrade Ravensthorpe. There's quests that you can get from upgrading it. You know, you're building people's houses and stuff, but it's not nearly as investive as of an undertaking as it might initially sound. Basically, there's only a couple people whose quests are actually worth doing, especially if you like the lore of this series. And I know I've been talking very mediocrely about this game. You know, everything just seems to be meh, but there are good parts of it, and I will get to that in the next segment. Valhalla, in particular, definitely sets itself aside as an Assassin's Creed game by letting you establish the Hidden Ones Bureau in this game. And from the Hidden Ones Bureau, you get what is, in my opinion, and has been for all three of these open world Assassin's Creed games, one of the best elements of the game, which is the Order Hunt. Now, in Origins, for recap, the Order Hunt was basically you hunting down members of this group called the Order of the Ancients. And in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you hunt down the Cult of the Cosmos, which is more or less the same thing. And basically in Origins, it was only really story. It was a small list. It was just kind of there to represent how far you were in the main story. It wasn't really like a fully fleshed out thing. And now we got to talk about how great Odyssey is and say that they completely fleshed out in Odyssey. This system is more like Odyssey, where you have open world. You know, there's people around the world to get. They're all doing different things. They're in different parts of culture. But other than the ones that are mandatory for the story, which all three have had ones in the order chart that have been mandatory for the story, unlike that, not only is Valhalla smaller than Odyssey, but actually that's a good thing, because unlike Odyssey, where everyone in the chart was like a different part of society, so you had your roaming merchants or your roaming mercenaries, people running things out at the sea, people in Athens, people in Sparta, you know, people in the military, people who are merchants, sell swords, all kinds of people in the church, or you know, in the religious things. Unlike that, in Valhalla, basically everyone is doing the same thing when you come find them. So like in Odyssey, like I said, some people could only be found at sea. So you would try to hunt them down at sea. Maybe there'd be clues on islands you would go to and you find them. It feels like a grand scavenger hunt leading up to a big fight. And in Valhalla, you basically do the scavenger hunt, and then they're just kind of standing around waiting for you to kill them. I think only one or two of them that are not required by the story of an area actually want to fight you. And it's not that it's too easy. It's just that it feels bland. It feels like I'm just ticking off a checkbox rather than, oh, well, I've hunted him down and then we had a cool fight. You know, he knew I was coming, or yeah, you know, you stealth killed him. Obviously, if you stealth kill him, it's Assassin's Creed, right? You stealth kill him, cool. But here they're not even on alert. You could just walk right up to them and stab them, and the game will mark them for you if you want. You just walk right up and stab them. There's no need to find them. There's no mission. There's nothing. And I feel like that's kind of lame, because instead of trying to figure out, well, how do I kill him when he's surrounded by guards and he's a tough fight, you know, or how do I get him, you know, in the sea and shoot him down, board his ship and kill him. Here you just walk up, you stab him, you get the cutscene, you leave. And that's it. And it feels very blasé. It feels just like another thing. And while I do still like the fact that it's in the game, it's not as well done. Now, the mercenary system in Odyssey, which functions similarly to, say, the wanted levels in GTA, this game doesn't do that. Instead, there are zealots who are also on the order chart, and these zealots will run around the map, and they stay in a general area. They don't run around the map. They stay in a general area. They're basically your mercenaries in your actual fights. You know, they're usually kind of tough. Everyone uses a different weapon or a different style of fighting. Obviously, earlier in the game, they're a little bit harder. And without saying too much, there's an option in the game that you can have that will have them hunt you down. I actually chose to let them hunt me down as opposed to remaining anonymous. I did not notice them hunting me down at all. Like, you would think, okay, well, maybe if I get too close to them, the AI will leash them to me to try to force an encounter that I then have to either sneak away from or engage in. Never happened. Not once. Not even once did that happen. So that ultimately didn't lead anywhere, and that was ultimately a big disappointment. And unfortunately, most of the open world events for this game don't get much better. There's cairns, which are basically, think about like stacking rocks if you don't know what it is. The whole goal of it is to stack rocks. The physics system is pretty alright, but one of them took me 2 hours, and it was the most unintuitive thing I've ever seen in my life. And I'm going to remember that. And if you watch part whatever, where I went to Yervikshire for the first time, it was that. And I sped it up by a factor of 1 second in real life, means 30 seconds, or what was it, like 30 seconds in the game, in the recording. It took me 2 hours to stack it. It was terrible. But it's not necessarily bad. There's the curse symbols. There's the fly agaric. There's finding things like treasure hoards and this saga that someone wrote spread around the map. Other than, the world events, like I said before, you know, these all give you events, or I'm sorry, these all give you like level up credit, right? They give you skill points when you complete them, I'm sorry, some of them give you skill points when you complete them. Most of them will give you just experience when you do that. And like I said, I was able to hit 400 way before not way, but reasonably before the end of the game. So by skipping all the world events, mind you, after like basically the first area, and even that wouldn't have made too much of a difference, I feel. Unfortunately, I don't feel like it's worth map clearing in this game. I don't feel like it's worth going out of your way to do everything on the world map. And the reason I say that is because in two areas in the game, there's a bunch of treasure you need to collect. You go to an altar and sacrifice it. All you get are 5 points. 5. That's it. For all your hard work, taking 2 hours to comb this area from start to finish like crazy, you get 5 points, which I guess will help you if you're behind. But it feels like if you're really playing this game, you're doing everything, right? You're clearing every area, you're doing everything. You're not skipping it. Because if you're skipping stuff, you're just doing the story, you would just not do this and it wouldn't apply to you, right? So you wouldn't need the 5 points because you wouldn't clear one area, without knowing what the reward is, because they don't tell you 5 points is the only thing you get. And then you would just not do it. You play the game, you do the story, you probably beat the game no problem anyway. But in the case of someone who is map clearing and is doing everything in the game, 5 points is not good enough of a reward to justify it. I could have done side quests or I'm sorry, world events and gotten 5 points probably. But I mean, it all comes down to what you do, but it doesn't really matter anyway because you don't need to be that high of a level to beat the game anyway. So ultimately, it's kind of a nothing deal. Other areas just don't give you anything when you fully complete it. So really what I'm trying to say is that there's only a couple of world events that are actually worth doing. And in my mind, and I'll say this at the end of the review, most of the events in this game are not necessary at all. There are 3 kinds of events. There are blue events, which are called mysteries. These include world events, fly agarics, which is where you eat some mushrooms and solve a puzzle or a combat challenge. They include viewpoint puzzles, where you need to get the right angle for a puzzle, which gives you a skill point. These include cairn stacking, and maybe like 1 or 2 others I'm forgetting. There are artifacts like Roman masks, cursed symbols, which are like little mini puzzles where a cursed area of ground is around, and you need to shoot an arrow into a skull to like lift the curse on the ground. They also include sagas, treasure charts and other things like that. And then there's yellow, which in my opinion is the worst category because it's not really a category at all, which is broken down into 2 things. Armors and weapons, which are marked by the same icon, so that don't think that you'll be able to tell the difference unless you look it up. And upgrade materials. And that brings me back kind of to what I said earlier about ore being rare. Well, actually, to upgrade your armor and weapons, you need to spend what are basically 3 upgrade materials, depending on what quality you want to push it to. There's base quality, which is no upgrade. There's bronze, which is used by upgrading something with copper. There's nickel, which is superior, and then you can it's like a silver color. You could upgrade that. And then there's basically gold level, which is used by getting tungsten ingots. And depending on what area you're in, you'll be able to find these from killing enemies or looting chests and stuff like that. And I think the biggest problem with it becomes that the only thing that these do is limit how much you can upgrade your weapons and armor. Which basically, like when you upgrade armor and weapons, it increases how much you can upgrade it, not what it actually like. You don't boost the stats of a weapon by upgrading it with using these ingots. So, like, let's say my weapon does 10 attack and it's a white weapon. I haven't upgraded at all. Well, if I upgrade it to rank 3, which is gold, I just say, okay, I'm going to push this one weapon through to the end. You don't get any bonuses until you actually spend the ore, the leather, and the titanium to upgrade it along those charts. All this does is change its max level from like 3 to 10. And obviously, the lesser values or the lesser ingots change it, to a lower level and stuff. And you upgrade everything sequentially. Again, because of how rare these things are and how much of a pain in the ass it is to go out of your way to get enough, I don't really encourage swapping equipment too much once you get a general gist of what you want to wear. Which brings me to my next problem. By the end, if you're doing map clearing, basically you are going to either end up riding by half the stuff looking for armor, or you're going to take every piece of yellow, and that means that some sets you won't even get completed till the end of the game, at which point, it doesn't really matter then, does it? And, yeah, you could play in the post game or whatever, but Valhalla's biggest problem is that if you're going to 100% it, you're probably going to play through the whole game 100%ing it. You're not going to wait until the end of the game to 100% it, because one, you won't have the level to fight things in the higher end areas, to start 100%ing the end game areas, and two, most of the stuff really comes from playing the game, either rushing it or playing it fully. Take your pick. And if you rush through the game, it's probably something like 30, 40 hours, maybe 50 if you do a little bit of other stuff. And if you fully max out everything, it's 100. I was at 99 hours, basically. So ultimately, to wrap up the gameplay segment of this game, I'm pretty sure I talked about everything. To wrap up the gameplay segment of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it's in almost every way inferior to Odyssey. Odyssey basically did every system better. Sure, they might have been pouring money and resources on you, but because they were plentiful and easy to get from a number of activities, like fighting on the Peloponnesian War, or fighting mercenaries and intentionally raising your wanted level and stuff like that. There were ways to get around doing this. You could take contracts and stuff, which are still in this game, but still kind of not worth it, in my opinion. You could do side quests, you could loot chests, loot places. There was never a dull moment in my playthrough of Odyssey. There was always something I was doing. Which, by the way, the world map of Odyssey, I'd say they're about the same. There's more land to cover in Valhalla, which, depending how disposed you are to wanting to sail or not, isn't bad. But everything is spread out. So, like, sometimes with camps, you'll just need to kill one dude and leave. Whereas before in Odyssey, there were a ton of areas, but each area had, like, different things to do. So it would be, like, kill the 3 lieutenants, kill the commander, loot the thing, find the Enigmata Ostraka. There's all these are contained in this one general area. And because of that, like, going over and searching everywhere feels rewarding, because eventually you're going to find the thing you're looking for. There's tons of other things. You could have Icaros scouted out, which, by the way, you do get an eagle in this game. It's actually a raven called Sinan. And unlike Icaros, who could mark things and track targets and do all sorts of stuff for you, Sinan kind of sucks. Sinan is really only there just to give you the bird's eye view of the area, and very rarely did I ever find myself using Sinan for actual reconnaissance. In this game, they upgraded the pulse that you could do to detect enemies and detect things. It's now just a click of the stick. It's actually one of the things I think is really well done in this game. It's your usual eagle vision, but because that got buffed and Sinan didn't really get anything, it's not really worth using the eagle most of the time. Now, you can upgrade your horse as well, which is another good thing I like. That's a positive. You could have more horse stamina. The horse can swim faster, and all that thing, which is good. I have no complaints about that whatsoever. Additionally, I like one element in particular, and I can't talk about it too much because it lends itself into the story very much, but there's a thing called an animus anomaly. And what an animus anomaly is basically you do a parkouring puzzle. It's like, it's like a parkour puzzle, like Assassin's Creed 2 style, and Revelation had some of these, and I think those are really, in my opinion, some of the best content in the game, if not the best side content in the game, if not at some points the peak of the game. And you could say that's sad, you could say it's whatever. I think the reward for it, they lay it out ahead of time, like, whoa, something weird is going on here. Hey, maybe if you do all 10 of these, and they tell you, by the way, how many there are, so you're not like assuming there's a billion of them. 10. Find 10 of these in the open world, and let's explore and let's do them. And each one is basically in the open world. You can see it from a distance away. It's a glitchiness. You go over to it, you do the little puzzle. It's actually kind of nice. It's soothing. You get lore, you get all kinds of stuff, and it's relevant towards the story of the game. And when I say that this is some of the best content in the game, I absolutely mean it, because it's actually something I feel like they detail what the reward is. If you don't like the story, then fuck it, who cares, right? Cool. But if you're here for Assassin's Creed at this point, you probably at least are loosely interested in the story, and this gives it to you exactly how you need it. It's similar to Assassin's Creed 2, where you were finding the different puzzles on the sides of buildings, that would lead you to these weird cryptography missions, which were way too difficult, I feel. These are just more about platforming and parkour, and I think that they work out perfectly fine for what they need to do. These get an A+ from me. Best parts of the game, in my opinion, and I love it. But ultimately, as I said, Assassin's Creed Valhalla on almost every level, combat, stealth, I think the areas for stealth don't really lend themselves too well to stealth, but combat, stealth, upgrading, side quests, materials, all this sort of stuff, like, it exists, but I feel like it's just not as good. It's not as well done. And because of that, like, it's hard to justify saying, well, Odyssey was not only shorter, but did this shit better. And even the same year that this game came out, there was Ghost of Tsushima, which in my opinion is like, mwah, the chef's kiss on top of all of this. And that's what I really think is the biggest problem with it, is that Valhalla suffers from being neither as good as the last incarnation from 2 years ago, well, at this point, 2.5, and not as good as the game that came out the same year as it, which heavily competes with it, in my opinion. Maybe not for story, but Ghost of Tsushima has a good story. It's just not a long-running franchise. Assassin's Creed is like 14 years old at this point. And the abilities are a letdown. Not even till the end of the game were the abilities good, because each ability you have to upgrade by finding a book, which is also a yellow icon. I forget about this because it's whatever. But you only find books by searching forts, and again, the game doesn't tell you until you're close enough to scan it with your eagle vision what these books are, if it's a book, or if it's a chest piece, or if it's an upgrade material. So you're going to be left guessing unless, again, you look it up, which is one of my things about this game. I think they really wanted to sell guides or something. I don't know. It just kind of feels that way to me. And even then, like, only certain abilities I found actually useful. In Odyssey, I found that there weren't enough slots on Odyssey for the abilities I wanted to use. In this game, I find that there were 4 abilities maybe I used, and then 2 ranged abilities that might be useful. One of the things this game does is every single area is a puzzle. So if you want to get inside this house to pick up this random collectible, it's a puzzle. You want to find a way into this tomb, it's a puzzle. You want to find a way to do anything, like, oh, you need to get inside of here. It's either a perspective puzzle where you need to find the perfect place to perch to shoot an arrow to break a lock or to do something, or you need to parkour your way in, or you need to find the key off of someone. Usually the game is okay about keys, right? But it just, when it's done once or twice, it's cool, it's special, it felt like I had to work for it. But when it's done for almost every single collectible and side objective, it begins to be taxing. It begins to feel like I'm just pushing time into this just so I can get an outcome, just so I can say I 100% the game, which doesn't even get you anything anyway. I think it's cool to make sure that people aren't just walking in, taking stuff, and then leaving. But it's also cool to have that in balance. Not every single generic house housing a generic collectible needs to be a 1 to 2 minute puzzle to find the right place to stand or whatever to get in. And once you know the tricks, you get used to it. But it was very frustrating sometimes figuring out what I could and could not do. A couple of things I just had to look up because either A, they were locked by story reasons, which the game does not tell you, which I think the game should if they're going to do this, or B, it was just really obscure, and I would not have found it without some excessive amount of time sinking into it. I feel like the game, if it's locked by story, should say, "Oh, hey Layla, this thing is blocked by the animus memory. You need to come back later." You could have, and that's the whole point of the animus, is to have that sort of like, "Hey, this is a memory. It's something that happens later." And that way I would immediately know, all right, don't waste my time on it, move on, I'll come back here as a part of the story. This game doesn't do that, which is annoying. So it's almost like, unfortunately, the game wants you to run between... The game wants you to simultaneously 100% it, but also just kind of do the story. And I feel like if I'm going to beat the story before all of this, right? Like if they just want me to run through the story so I clear out every area that's necessary for the story, and then come back and fill in the blanks, then I feel that that's just unnecessary. One, I don't think the game requires it. And two, it would be unnecessary grinding that I wouldn't need to do, and I wouldn't be incentivized. If you could beat an area of a game without any struggle or any requirement to level up in that area, right? Then what's the point of having bonus stuff in that area? There is none. It becomes redundant. There's no reason to do it. And, other games solve this by having you level up in these areas, right? You come in, you're a low level, or there's rewards, you get upgrade points that tangibly make a difference in your rotation or how you play the game. Like in Odyssey, there's a lot of areas I could have just gone from A to B in the story, cleared it, been done in 3 hours. Even less sometimes. But the reason I didn't is because each point that I got, each thing I got, maybe there was an interesting quest, there were choices that would come back and affect me later. There are choices in this game, they don't really affect as much, but people live, people die, does it really matter? You only see them once or twice and then they're gone. And it was a reason to do it in Odyssey, whereas here there's not really much of a reason. But yeah, it feels like they want you to 100% the game and at the same time not 100% the game. And I feel like that's bad design, because you're kind of saying to people, yeah, we want you to look all over the place and see everything and go everywhere and do everything, but we want you to do it after you've done the most important thing that's the only reason you're in the zone in the first place. So it feels like it's kind of like getting contradictory instructions from the game, because you don't really need to do half of this. The story will level you up probably almost enough that you'll be competitive for the most part, and then you just do whatever happens to be in front of you at the time and move on. And unfortunately, the gameplay of Valhalla, while fun at times, is a sine curve of just fun and bullshit, and it never ends. And I think that's the biggest fault of it, is that, I feel like I'm in purgatory more than anything at points. At its highs, this game is fantastic, it's amazing, maybe even better than Origins and Odyssey. But those are few and far and fleeting between, whereas at the minimum, this game is a waste of time. I feel like I'm grinding for nothing, and I don't even get anything out of it, and you really ultimately kind of almost don't. Now, you might like the whole mystery element, and in which case, I think this game, you'd probably really enjoy it, if that's the case. I think you would absolutely thoroughly enjoy playing this game and finding all the puzzles and spending a lot of time. You could spend hundreds of hours in this game if you look nothing up and just try to deduce everything yourself, and that might actually be really, really fun. You might have a good time. But for me, it's not my idea of a good time. I think that there should be some structure. It's, ironically, right? An open world game that has no structure is not that great, isn't it? But you can have a backbone and then do whatever you want, I feel. I think that that's what Valhalla doesn't do correctly, is that it does not have a backbone upon which to base this. Which brings me to the one thing about the game I really, really liked almost, wholeheartedly, which is the story. The story of Assassin's Creed Valhalla is one of the better Assassin's Creed game stories. I think there's enough twists and turns that this game is fundamentally fun as hell to play from start to finish. Now, like I said, this game is an area-by-area progression, and because each area is given the same amount of importance up until the finale of the game, not every area has the best story. Some of them you could tell are filler. You're just there because you need to make an alliance and nothing else really. And while they can be funny and have their cute and charming characters or serious shit going on, ultimately I feel like it's not really that greatly done when you're in a side area. Some of them are just kind of boring snooze fests, but a lot of them are interesting. But when you're on the main story, oh my god, the game is interesting. And ultimately the game does have a moment where you can have all your previous allies show up and help you out. And that's one of the cool things I like about games like this. It feels like you're actually tangibly getting something out of it. Now, do they really help you? Not really. You kind of just do what you need to do. And I'm sure you could probably get to that point without having recruited all of them, although maybe not, if in which case that would be kind of lame. But it is what it is. The game has a kind of open structure. You could choose which areas out of a set you can go to. And obviously, you complete one area, maybe the story continues in another area later on. A lot of these people know each other. There's a lot of shared lore between them all, which is kind of cool. And I actually really did enjoy the story of this game. Even the areas that weren't as great were still pretty good. They were still pretty tolerable. At its peak, the story gets off the chain good and crazy. The final couple of twists were pretty good. There were a couple of areas early on that were meh. Then there were also a couple of areas towards like the middle part that were pretty interesting and unique. And I thought that that was really kind of cool. So the story, not to talk too much about it, obviously, gets like a 9 from me at its best. And at its worst, it's only like a 7. Now, Eivor as a character is a very, very interesting character. I didn't like him too much at first, but he grew on me. Definitely, I like all three of the Assassin's Creed protagonists from this era of games, and I really do thoroughly enjoy it. Now, let's talk about something I don't like. And this is not actually points necessarily against this game, but I feel like you should know it because I didn't know it playing this game and going into it. So what Assassin's Creed Valhalla does is the same thing that Assassin's Creed Odyssey does. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you could pick the sex of your character. You could pick between the male, who was named Alexios, or Cassandra, who was the female. Now, what they don't tell you is that canonically, Cassandra is the main character. This was something Ubisoft did after the fact, and they went around and they had a novelization where they confirmed it, and this game, Valhalla, outright confirms Cassandra was the main character of Odyssey, with no room, no wiggle room, no shred of a doubt. And I feel that on Ubisoft's account, and after the whole leaks that they had, and showing that they're afraid to have anyone besides straight white male protagonists for the most part, which is funny because Bayek is not white, they feel that it will hurt their sales of the game if they market it with a female protagonist up front. And it's very obvious that they want to have feet in both buckets, basically. They want to sit on both sides of the fence and have people have a male character, and they'll show off the male character everywhere, and they show off the female character, but they mostly show off the male character. They pretend like your choice of a sex doesn't really matter, and then they lay the boom on you, and they're like, by the way, only one was canon. And I feel that in a game where the story matters this much, they could do something like Mass Effect, right? They could do something like Mass Effect. It's something, first of all, they didn't need to do. They could have had the Mystios just be the title, the Eagle Bearer. It's a gender neutral term, so that way it's ambiguous which one is which. Because other than name dropping Cassandra, there was no reason. And I find that it's pussyfooting on Ubisoft's part because they're too afraid to have a female protagonist. The fucking cowards. Just do it. It's clear that they want to do it. I don't know for what reason. I hope it's for good reason. They can tell a good story with it as opposed to just representation and diversity. But, maybe not. I don't know. They do it again in Odyssey, or in Valhalla. They do it again. Canonically, they have let the Animus choose for you, which I wasn't sure what that even really meant. What it really means, because I'll tell you, is that you basically play as a female the whole game. And then there's 2 areas where you play as male Eivor. And that's it. And I feel that, again, you're kind of doing a disservice by just not letting people choose which Eivor they want. I feel like in games where you can freely customize the character you play, in this game you can do it, in Odyssey you could do it, and in Valhalla you could do it, or I'm sorry, in Origins you could do it. You just let people choose what you want. You give them a gender neutral term. Every game has done this. Like Commander Shepard is one of the most iconic things in Mass Effect. I don't think they confirmed which one they really liked. And if they want to have a female protagonist be the main character, then that's fine. Do you not trust the writing and the fans to do that enough? Because then they turn around and then they do a whole bunch of other bullshit. And I know this is a very behind-the-scenes rant outside of the scope of the game, but I just want to let you know the same thing ahead of time, that if you go into this assuming that male Eivor's on the cover, and then the game lets you choose, and it's just, it's whatever, Eivor is a shared name between the both of them, right? It shouldn't really matter because, whatever. No, they confirmed it. It's not that at all. And they were too chicken shit to actually own up to it, and they barely owned up to the one from Odyssey as well. And I just wish that they would just, if they want to make a female protagonist, just fucking do it. You have the series staying power. Just do it. Don't pussyfoot. Don't have me play this game for 100 hours and say, by the way, everything you saw was fucking fake. It didn't happen. Not at all. Because I actually really liked Alexios' performance. I really liked just the way he was portrayed in the game. I thought he was a really funny character at times. And then also he could have some emotional moments. And it's very hard, in action games especially, to have male characters have moments of emotion, moments of weakness. You're not really allowed to have that for the most part. And I think that really is something that when I do see it, it's kind of cool. Even in games like Wolfenstein, where BJ Blazkowicz has moments to himself where he's just like, I'm tired of fighting. I don't want to fight anymore. It's heart touching, You play a game that's murder, 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 your character has to be strong. And even then he's still getting fucked over, facing impossible odds. It's nice to have that. And I feel like you kind of throw all that talent and all that out the window when you just say, well, only one of these is canon and the other one is whatever. Then just force me to play as female Eivor. Just make it so Eivor is female, and just whatever you need to do else is whatever you need to do. And I feel like it's a very last minute decision. I don't think the game is designed with that intention, and I think it's a load of bullshit. So they confirmed that in this game too, which is kind of dumb. Other than that, the story of this game is pretty straightforward. You are basically helping Eivor establish a colony alongside Sigurd, who is basically his brother in arms. Eivor, as a child, lost both his parents, and they died without honor. And from that, he was attacked by a wolf, which is how he acquired the name Wolf-Kissed. And the game goes from there. You basically build Eivor's legacy from the start of just helping Sigurd, and you start helping to, unite and pledge other people to your cause, which is a very fun thing. Ravensthorpe expands as you get more and more people. There's the Assassins versus the Order of the Ancients plotline, which is really just the Hidden Ones versus the Order of the Ancients plotline. Isn't that big in this game. For sure, you have Assassin, or the Hidden Ones show up very early, and the Order, like I said, they're not really that big, except for a couple of areas and a couple of people. They're not really that big. The story, in fact, most of that story kind of takes a back seat until you complete the Order plotline, which you can only do in the post game. The area-by-area stories are hit or miss. They're not terrible. Like I said, like a 7 at worst, a 9 at best. And that's really it. I mean, the story, like I said, I can't talk too much about it because it's in my opinion, the best part of the game. Next to the Animus Anomalies. Now, the soundtrack of this game is actually really well done. I like it a lot. Jesper Kyd, I hope I pronounced his name, is the same guy who worked on the original Ezio trilogy and Darksiders 2. So, it's going to be good. There's definitely that sort of feel. I like when you're in Norway and they play the very open, looming music. There's a couple areas in England where they have really good sounding music. Hey, there's not too much to say about it. I think the soundtrack is good. Graphically, the game looks pretty good. The problem is that the game suffers during big castle skirmishes or monastery raids or whenever a lot's going on. And the game crashes. As the more I patch the game, the more the game crashed. And it'll crash out of nowhere. Now, thankfully, this game's autosave is fantastic. It's amazing. No problem with the game's autosave. But other than that, I mean, the game just crashes a lot. All it really is it's like a 3-minute break where you have to reboot the game. Whatever. It's not the worst thing in the world that ever happened. And other than that, what is the conclusion I can give for Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Well, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a mediocre game. In every aspect, almost. Other than Animus raids, and maybe a couple fights between Drengers and other things. And the story is pretty good, I guess, if you like the story of Assassin's Creed. And the soundtrack is good. Otherwise, I would almost recommend Odyssey in almost every facet over this game. This game does not outperform Odyssey in most areas. In fact, it feels like a regression almost even from Origins in some areas. So as what could be the final of this style of game that we're getting, I think it's a disappointment. And that's where I'll pretty much leave it. So what would I give Assassin's Creed Valhalla on the scale? I'm going to give Assassin's Creed Valhalla a 79 out of 100. And the reason being is that the problems with the gameplay, while the game works and it's fun, and I just feel like really the only right way to play the game is just to rush through the story, do whatever you need to do, and do the Animus Anomalies. I recommend those personally. And outside of that, just, whatever. If you find loot, cool, and just find a set of armor, just go at it. It's not really the kind of in-depth game I would really say that Assassin's Creed should be. It's certainly not even the in-depth game that we got 2 years ago. And as I said in the playthrough quite a few times, if you presented me Valhalla and Odyssey side by side, and I didn't know what year they came out, and you told me one of these came before a 2-year break before the other, I would assume that Odyssey was the last game, because it just has that many more improvements over Valhalla. But in any event, thank you for listening. It's been a long verdict. There was a lot to talk about, and I will see you on the next one.